I'm recording my homily for the fourth Sunday of Lent. Just to keep in mind that on Sundays from now on, we are streaming our Mass on Facebook. At least we're attempting to continue to do that. And so if I don't record my homily on YouTube, then you can go to Facebook and see the Mass there and see the homily there. Okay? But nonetheless, I'm still recording my homily right now for YouTube. So there is something that is invisible because it's so small, none of us have ever seen it, and it's quite powerful. In fact, I have to say it's probably the most powerful thing in terms of impacting humanity that we've ever seen in the natural world. In terms of what it's costing the world financially, our government's just approved a $2 trillion package to deal with this little tiny invisible entity. Nothing's ever really cost us that before. In terms of human life, the cost has been very high. In terms of unsettling humanity, in terms of fear and changing behavior, there's been nothing really more powerful than this little tiny invisible virus that none of us have ever even seen. But the reality is there is something that is also invisible. I don't know if you can say it's tiny, but it is invisible. And it's even more powerful than the virus. It can transform human beings to respond in a way in which they don't fear the virus, in which no matter what it costs financially, there's always something of more value in their life. It can't disrupt their lives. They'll still respond with courage. There's a picture that's been on the internet. You may have seen it, just like in the news articles and stuff. It's of a nurse in Italy. And so in northern Italy, they've been hit particularly hard by the effects of the virus, and many, many people have died. There's a picture of a nurse in the hospital, and she's so utterly, completely exhausted. She's completely spent that she's just conked out on her desk. And you can tell just by the way she's conked out, or it's like her head's on her keyboard of her computer, that to sleep like that, she had to have nothing left to give. Now, nurses work for money just like the rest of us. You know, when we work a job, we get a paycheck. But I'm telling you that it was not money that kept her there working to that extent. It wasn't, nobody could pay her enough money to do that. She was doing it for another reason. Because there's something invisible inside of her that's causing her to have courage and to pour herself out to make a great sacrifice for the sake of others, to save others, to help others, even just to be there when they're dying. That's powerful. That's more powerful than this virus. And so you begin to see that in humanity, that when we realize what is more important and what is most important, we're not afraid of it. That doesn't mean we're reckless. There's a church down in Louisiana that's still insisting upon meeting even though it's against the law, right? I suppose in some ways that could be considered reckless. So it's not necessarily that we're doing that, but that it would motivate us out of love for others. So what is this invisible thing that I'm talking about? It's called grace. It's grace which bestows faith, hope, love. But it's God Himself. It's God's life in and of itself being present within us and being actuated and lived out in us. And so we turn to God in moments like this, right? This other little invisible entity was born in a jungle, in a very far off land that none of us will ever see. But the other invisible entity was born in a garden. It was born in a garden of her son. And you remember that garden when he's getting ready to pour himself out for all of us, out of love for us, to make the ultimate sacrifice, that God will die for us. It's beautiful when you think about it. The gospel, you have the blind man who's healed by Jesus. And you have this story of the blind man who has a number of people around him reacting to this healing, of Jesus healing him in different ways. But one of the things that it does to him is it gives him just this natural courage. I shouldn't say natural. It gives him this supernatural courage to even stand up to people, the leaders, who would accuse him or accuse others of doing something wrong. And he's able to see the fallacy of that. They even bring in his parents. And now, I'm not getting on parents here, right? But his parents in this story fail. They're afraid of the leaders, and so they say, well, ask our son, don't ask us. So they throw their son under the bus because it says they're afraid. They're afraid of being expelled from the synagogue. And the son is like, are you guys crazy? How can you say that Jesus, the one who healed him, is in the wrong? That's just madness, right? And so this blind man fasts, if you will, for almost all his life from ever seeing the sun. He never sees light. And then Jesus restores it. He gives him that grace. And I promise you, he will never ever take that for granted. And so we're fasting, right? We're fasting from the Eucharist. We're not necessarily starving. We can go buy food. We just can't have the Eucharist. And I hear stories about people who are trying to find all kinds of ways of maneuvering around that so they can receive the Eucharist. But I think in some ways they're failing to understand the power of this moment where in this fast, we're learning to not take the Eucharist for granted. It's not ours to seize, right? It's a gift. All grace is a gift. And for us to use it. In the blind man also you see what a true leader is. Jesus, he demonstrates the leader's failing and this blind man who has power over nothing to lead, to have wisdom to lead. I'm reading this book right now, and there's one part where it says that, so this book is just on how to be better priests, right? And it says there was one thing that Jesus really, really struggled with, and that was weak men. And especially the leaders, right? So when they were weak, this blind man demonstrates the opposite of that. I have to say, sometimes the wisest things I've ever heard said actually came from people that were homeless. And yes, their lives were a mess and they were making lots of bad decisions. And maybe they weren't living it perfectly, but sometimes there's a great wisdom there in areas that we wouldn't even think about. I sometimes wonder if this test or these tests are really to test us just to see how we will react and how we will respond, right? There was another quote in that book that I forgot. I wrote it down somewhere. Anyways, all right. But there's another part in the book, as I was reading, that I thought was very powerful. So he conveys a story. And in this story, there's a priest who goes to visit this young woman who's dying. And he gets to know her through this story. And her condition is such that in her brain, the blood vessels, I guess, are weakening, or I don't know all the medical things that were going on, but the blood vessels in the brain were having problems, and it was causing severe headaches, and it was going to lead to her death. It was getting worse and worse. And so the only thing they could do was just to kind of ease it, was to inject directly into her brain something that would strengthen the blood vessels, so at least temporarily she wouldn't have quite as much headaches. Wasn't necessarily going to solve the problem per se. And she was going to need 30 of these injections. They were going to use this really long needle and just inject it directly into the brain. Very painful procedure. And so the priest is with her and kind of journeying with her along this path. And she says, I'm not scared for myself. She says, I'm scared for my friends. Because so many of them don't know God. So many of them are living lives of sin. And they're her friends. She loves them because of that love, but because of also for her love for Jesus. She's worried about them. So she comes up with this plan that each time she gets one of these injections into the brain, she's going to offer it for one of her friends. And she would say their name out loud as they're pressing this needle through her skull into her brain. And so one by one, she starts naming off her friends. At this young lady's funeral, there were many, many of her friends. And her friends were typical of this generation. They came into the church. They probably haven't been in the church in many years, inside the church building. They didn't even know really how to behave. So they just act casual. And they're talking. During the Mass, they're even texting. It was almost like they weren't really engaged. It's almost like they didn't even know how to be present to each other, much less to anybody else in that moment. And so the priest begins telling this story when she's receiving these injections, how she begins to name them one by one, and she's offering it for them. And by the time he's done telling this story, the whole church has changed. People are actually entering into the moment, and they're actually entering into her pain, and they're feeling her pain. And what the priest is doing is he's giving them the ability to love her in a real way, not in a superficial way. And I suppose each one of those friends who was there was wondering whether or not one of them was mentioned by her. You have this example of the power of this invisible entity that we call grace. It is more powerful than anything that can threaten us in the natural world. We have countless stories. Sometimes we become too caught up in our own lives and the busyness and the silliness of our own lives that we don't even see those examples. We can read about them constantly. All you have to do is look for them. You just read about the saints or just people who are suffering, and you'll see these heroic, incredible accounts of grace at work. And then we look at the coronavirus and realize it's actually really not that powerful. In fact, when we really look at it, we can even see the giftedness of it. And I'm not saying that the pain and everything we're going through is good. I'm not saying that at all. But grace can transform it. I'm not necessarily seeing it right now in some of the little struggles I have because of my own pettiness, right? I'll complain and whine. But hopefully I'll be able to see it. All right. I'm going to continue recording my homilies for daily Mass. I missed a couple days. I apologize. But I'm going to try and get back on track and stay connected, all right? All right. God bless you all. I hope you're doing well. All right, so the fourth Sunday of Lent, every time I record my homily, the train goes by, and then it just distracts me. All right.